What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip. You're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, and today on the podcast, we have a dynamic duo of dialectical, excitement. I was trying to think of another D for the alliteration. Anyway, this is an entry into the dialectical den of theological love with Travis McMaken and David Congdon, both of whom have been on the podcast before. Both of whom are clearly buddies, friends, partners in dialectical theology and in life, but they're on the podcast at the same time. I recorded this in their hotel room during the American Academy of Religion, and the conversation was wide-ranging and included a large number of things that I had to edit out of the podcast. So it took a while to get it to you. But here it is. We talk about dialectical theology and a whole bunch of other things, which if you don't know what that is, you're about to find out. And then we have some fun. It ends with some high-quality book recommendations from the two about where to begin if you're thinking dialectical theology. So if you want to get the books, then clearly you should just go to tripfuller.com and click the links there, because then if you go and purchase the books, Amazon gives me a portion and it helps pay for the podcast. So that's just one option. You know, some people in life store homebrewed Amazon links so they'll hook me up where it doesn't cost them anything extra, but not everyone does. You know, it's like the non-violent book purchasing arrangement of the Marines. Like, you know, the Marines are the few and the proud, and the people that use homebrewed Amazon links are the ones that use homebrewed Amazon links. It's an elite group. Anyway, we're jumping in to this conversation. Before I do, I just want to invite everyone to some summer excitement. What is it? Well, good asking. I'm putting together a course with my buddy Jake over at the Post-Structuralist Tent Revival podcast with Jack Caputo, or John D. Caputo, philosopher extraordinaire. We're doing a class this summer over the month of June on Paul Tillich and theology of culture. We're going to read Paul Tillich, James Cone, the pioneer of black liberation theology here in the United States of America. And we're going to read Mary Daly, feminist provocateur. Oh, yeah. We're going to read some of Jack's own work, or John D. Caputo's own work. To join the class, all you got to do is go to johndcaputo.com. Oh, yeah, johndcaputo.com. Go there. You can join the class, have some fun this summer, get your theology of culture on. Yeah, it's going to be amazing. So, yeah, do that. And also, I'll be letting you know next week. Next week is the launch of all sorts of exciting things here at Homebrewed Christianity. And you'll find out more about it, okay? But go ahead, go check out the new website. It's in progress, tripfuller.com. Or you can go to homebrewedchristianity.com. It goes to the same place now. It does. All right. I'm excited because I just drank too much coffee. And it's early morning. So, sorry for that. Now, here's a podcast episode. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. This is Trip. It's Homebrewed Christianity, and we are in the den of love. It's a dialectical den of love. The two gentlemen across from me, one of them's named Travis. The other one's been called Travis because their Twitter attachment's very high. But David Congdon and Travis are back on the podcast, and I'm going to basically get them to talk to each other. Because
we never do that.
No, I say that as a goal, so I don't talk too much. You know?
That's never been an issue.
Oh my God. You invite a guy on the podcast, third time on, he's like, I'm just going to do whatever the hell I want. I went to beer camp. Now I just say things. Well, David, I'm glad you're here.
Thanks.
So do like a 30-second intro to yourself if people don't know, because then I have like an actual first question I want to ask and then see what y'all do.
Yeah, well, the last time you were on,
you guys had me on the podcast, I was an editor at IVP. I'm not that anymore. I'm an editor at the University Press of Kansas. So I still edit books, but different books now. I do politics and law. And so I'm here at AAR, having fun, just hanging out, drinking beer, talking with friends. But I write theology on the side now. So
It's your side gig?
it's my side gig. It's a second full-time job, although I don't get paid for that job.
There's got to be more lucrative options in the gig economy.
Yeah.
That's what you tell us now.
Is there an Uber for theology?
There needs to be. Maybe this is an app we need to develop. Uber for dialectical theology.
You can like pull somebody
Uber.
up and like, I want to hear some good theology. I'll pay you, $7 and you can talk for 25 minutes.
What dialectical theologians in the neighborhood?
That's
It's kind of like a dialectical theological escort service.
I don't even know what to say about that.
Just go with it.
It's called grad school. You
Theo
have
Tinder.
You have intense romantic
Tinder?
encounters with a number of different schools of thought in graduate school, and you two were in school together, and you both.
We were in school together for a very long time.
Undergraduate and graduate.
Yep. And for both levels of graduate.
Yeah.
Wow, that is significant. That's a lot of years.
I feel like you're being sarcastic.
No. This isn't my first question. This is an aside.
Well, am I supposed to introduce myself or?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. I'm Travis. I do theology. I showed up at beer camp.
I feel like every time we say your last name, we should have a sound effect where you're like, I'm Travis McMaken. And then on the back, it's like, McMaken.
Make that happen, Trip. I want to see that. Or hear it.
No, we have to have a listener make the sound effect and then I'll use it. But you're like, hi, this is Travis McMaken. Like that.
This is a necessity.
Yeah. So anyway, so who fell in love with dialectical theology first and had to lure the other one over? Like, nah, this other thing you're reading, it ain't that cool.
Go ahead, David.
I mean, I would credit Travis. Travis with actually helping me to come along he was a year ahead of me at Princeton. So we both finished Wheaton in 3 years. I took a year off.
Because we're insane.
Yeah, yes. And we wanted to save money. But I took a year off and went back to work at a bookstore back in Portland, my hometown. And
you redeemed the time.
I did. I redeemed the time by reading lots of theology in those moments. So I worked at Borders now, rest in peace. But I worked there and read theology on the side. For fun, to kind of catch up, because I knew I was applying to Princeton, but I had no training whatsoever in theology. So I relied heavily on Travis, who had a year ahead of me. I would pester him with questions. I asked him about the application process and the courses to take. And then when I got there, I figured out what to do, who to read, what to read.
Yeah, I was a year ahead of you there. And then I also had a Bible and theology degree already.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's what I did at Wheaton.
I had an English degree, so I was
reading. Why you're the better writer.
He's a professional editor.
Yeah,
that's right. And I read a lot. I was doing a lot of poetry, and that was kind of my thing. And
I remember film as well. You won a student film award one year.
I did. I acted and wrote the screenplay for the film at Wheaton, and that was a lot of fun. So I thought, there was a time where I anticipated maybe I should go off and do film school in LA. That was going to be my path. I wanted to live that life, and
then theology got its hooks into you.
I was too much of a nerd. That's just honestly what it was.
That's very true.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I really feel like if your Boltmann book crosses 400 pages, you're a nerd. But at 500 pages, that's.
Isn't it more like 8?
It's 940 pages.
No, I'm just saying, at 400 pages, you're a lifetime nerd. You've already got it settled. Your next reincarnation is also a nerd. Yes, without having to do anything. Yeah. Just inertia.
And then also, once you got to Princeton, I helped you get into McCormick's justification seminar.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right. I mean, I depended a lot on that. But all that being said, that's the biographical narrative of how things progressed. But theologically, we were reading different things. I was reading more philosophy of religion.
I was reading Calvin.
I was reading more kind of contemporary continental philosophy, theology. Really interested in those conversations.
And I will say to this day, David remains the theorist for dialectical theology, and I take a lot of my cues from his work in that. So, I mean, we go back and forth with our different strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah. It's a tag team effort. Travis is more the historian, maybe. Perhaps.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. So, what was the first argument that y'all had in any of your schooling where you remember winning? You know, where you got done, you walked out, and you're in your head, you're just like, Travis just got owned.
So there's this concept called paradoxical identity.
You don't have like a list of things you argued about in div school? Like,
no, because
of all my friends, we all went on to PhDs. Like tonight, I'm recording another podcast, and the whole premise was, the three of us, one of us asks a question we want the other two to argue about, and everyone knew immediately what the question was they wanted to ask the other pairings, because like we had like the same arguments for 3 or 4 years, and I still don't understand why they don't agree with me.
I think that's the unique thing about our intellectual relationship is, I mean, we emphasize different things very often, and we come at problems from different angles very often. But also, I wouldn't say that we fundamentally disagree about very much at all, if anything. And I certainly don't think we've ever had any arguments.
There was one argument. There was one. And it wasn't really an argument. It was more like...
Well, you can't say there was one argument and then say there wasn't really an argument.
It can be an argument today.
There was a conversation we had in which I convinced you of something. This happened, I remember I was at IVP. It was over the phone, I believe. I think we were talking on the phone.
We hardly ever talk on the phone.
I know. It was a rare occasion. And this was about whether the resurrection is bodily or not.
Really?
We had a conversation about it, and I made a set of arguments about why I don't accept a bodily resurrection. And I remember so I gave a series of arguments regarding paradoxical identity, regarding all of the various dialectical concepts. And by the end of it, you said you agreed. And so like there was a series, like we moved from like skepticism to agreement. It wasn't as if like there was no real like disagreement or argument.
I will say this. There have been a number of issues on which you have been out in front of me, and that it's taken me time to live with a set of ideas. Like I very often, I mean, it hasn't happened recently because I feel like I've gotten over most of the big hurdles, but there were a number of issues in my theological development where I realized at one point earlier that I no longer had good theological reasons for continuing to hold those positions. But then it took time to become existentially okay with that. Right. Right. And in that way, I think you did run ahead on some of those issues. You were much quicker to embrace them at that existential level.
And I would say that's largely because I wasn't trained theologically. So I didn't have the allegiances and attachments to certain schools of thought and certain doctrines and traditions. I was quite ready to jettison a lot of that tradition. And so the arguments were more immediately appealing to me.
And just at a personality level, I have a deeply conservative reflex. And I make the joke that every morning I wake up a Reagan Republican and have to be converted anew.
And I'm a hard Enneagram 1. I'm ready to just jettison everything, reform the whole system. I want to, to take down the structures and repair the,
To the extent that I embrace disruption, it is a work of the Holy Spirit.
So when you think back to those doctrines that you had to come around to being okay with leaving behind, like what were the ones that were, most important to the faith of your upbringing?
I'd rather not talk about it.
I mean, I will say, I got fired for holding positions doctrinally and theologically that, I think, maybe that wasn't it. Maybe I shouldn't have publicized those views as much as I did or in any case, but that's, so yeah, I understand Travis's, concerns, but yeah, I had a whole host of positions and views I had to slough off over the years. I grew up a outspoken fundamentalist, self-described. I used to go to Young Earth creation meetings on Saturday mornings. And so and that was up through freshman year of college. So, it was
what do you do at a Young Earth creationist meeting? Like, other than be like,
you look at,
it ain't that old.
You look at slides of the Grand Canyon and the Mount St. Helens and say, look, this disproves evolution. And then you all congratulate yourselves and put yourself in the back and get literature to pass
I got
out.
witnessed to at the door by some fundamentalists once that were told me that they know the earth isn't that old because they carbon dated a live mollusk.
Yeah.
I tried to explain to them
was-
about carbon dating living things not being
This is
what's being tested. Like, I was just like, so when something dies, here's how, like, and you're like, what they're actually like checking how long something has not been animated.
Yeah.
So like if you do a live one and it doesn't work.
No, and this was a smoking gun they used because they tried to use dating of a rock from 10 years after the Mount St. Helens eruption to see how old this rock was. And of course they knew that it was only 10 years old, but the data, from the dating showed that it was some 10,000 years old or something like that. And it disproved carbon dating. Of course, that's not how it works. That's not how you use it, but that wasn't explained. So yeah, that was the chief piece of evidence that people would use.
One issue of shift that I will own up to is the question of feminism and women in ministry. I mean, and I bring this because I talk to my students about this one. I have all my papers from Wheaton still, and I can go and show you a paper from my first year at Wheaton where I'm like all for the patriarchy, and I can show you a paper from the last year of Wheaton where I'm doing something very different. So that would be one of the areas where over the course of my theological education I've moved.
Well, but in part, or how would you describe dialectical theology, its relationship to tradition? Like it has a very different structure for looking at tradition. Because in one sense, it's thoroughly shaped by insights from the tradition, especially certain Protestant doctrines and such. But on the other side, it's what was getting itself done in those doctrines is not what the previous holders thought, or what they were holding to was more than what they needed to or whatnot.
I'll leave this to the theorist.
Yeah, I mean, so dialectical theology is a modern theology in the sense that, like all modern theologies, it tries to identify a certain material principle or criterion by which to redefine and reorganize theology. So Schleiermacher had the feeling of absolute dependence. Harnack had his essence of Christianity as this fatherhood of God. And so you have
the brotherhood of man.
Exactly, right. So this is a common thread throughout all modern theologies is what's this norm or material principle that we can then redefine and kind of reconstruct Christian theology from the ground up around this principle. And so dialectical theology says we accept that that's what has to happen, that we have to reconstruct things, but we offer a different material principle, and that principle for it is the event of revelation, essentially. Now, I mean, there are different ways of theorizing that event. Barth had a certain account which changed over the course of his career, but in some ways it was some sort of divine intervention, some divine encounter. Bultmann had a more existential, eschatological event. Friedrich Gogarten had a more historical. He was a Trelchian student, so he had a more historicity of an event. So, in essence, it's all an event is the unifying idea. The Ereignis is the German word here. It's Heideggerian. It has connotations of other philosophical traditions.
And you did a whole like Twitter thread or three on that term, term event.
Yeah, I do think the term event is really crucial to understanding not just this theology, but a lot of theologies in the 20th century, because it's done a lot of work. And we don't need to get into that now necessarily, but that was what I would say. That's what makes dialectical theology dialectical, is the sense that the event has this dialectic internal to it.
And if you want to see those tweets, you hashtag Twitter Seminary.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, maybe it'd be helpful to say a bit more about how how dialectical theology understands the event, because there are so many people, especially people end up on Homebrew, they use the word event to mean all sorts of shit.
Yeah.
Like I remember the first time Caputo and I was on the podcast, he was talking about weak theology and the event. And I was like, yeah, but you just gave a lecture about the event at Claremont. There's never been a lecture that didn't talk about the event at Claremont, because everything's events for process. So like, it's not, you don't mean the same thing. Oh, and then you get all sorts of, each dialectical theologian has a different kind of structure for the rupture then someone like Jungel has a concept of the event. And so I think there's definitely a clear purchase for using the event as a concept, because as opposed to some like substance that fidelity is passing it on as if it was settled and you're just handing it off. But the relational dynamic of an event in dialectical theology, I think, to me, it comes across as the most radical break-in structure of an event. Like, it's precisely not what is normative. Can you kind of give contrast of how the radical nature of an event in dialectical thought?
Yeah, I mean, it is intended to be a rupture, to be a break of some kind. So Heidegger in his work, I mean, now Heidegger comes in actually later after dialectical theology, so he's not the originator of this. But one of the things he does in his later work is he offers a kind of etymological excavation of the term Eragnus. And one of the things he does is he looks at how Eragnus comes from three different strands. Eigen, meaning one's own, has a kind of existential component. There's the category of disclosure of the I. There's a sense of in which the I is at stake, how we see reality, see the world. And then there's also to appropriate, the appropriation of something. So there's three different kind of etymological streams here. So event is this disclosure that is examining something, but then transforming oneself in that. So it kind of has this existential component to it. Anyway, but the point there is that it's something that is both subjective and objective. There's something that in-breaking, but it's also disclosing something to oneself, and you see things in a new way because of this disclosure, because of this event. And I think for dialectical theology, the point here is that it's both immanent in history. So they're trying to resist a kind of supernatural, super historical event. They're trying to resist that kind of conception, but it's also not reducible to history. It's irreducible to nature, to what's given in the world. So in that sense, it remains elusive and not finalizable, in that sense. So that's the dialectic we're there, right? Where it's both internal to the history of our existence, but it's not accessible as a given that we have direct access to.
And that's where the idea of paradoxical identity comes in, right? Because the irreducibility is never demonstrable.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you've also done work with Badiou on event, right? In this context. So how do you tie that in? I
mean, Badiou is interesting. I mean, his work is, of course, coming after Heidegger, and he's trying to respond to Heidegger and offer a correction of being and time, offering being an event as an alternative to that. And I mean, what I like about Badiou's work is that it's very similar to a lot of this work. And actually, Badiou refers to Kierkegaard directly in his work as a Christianized version of what he's trying to do. He's a secular version or materialist version of Kierkegaard. But the point is, being is that which is mathematizable, that which we can count and is countable in the world. And the event is uncountable. It's not mathematically plottable, right? And so it escapes the vision that is determined by what's countable and organizable in this world. So there's a lot to like about Badiou. I think there's a lot of parallels and similarities between these formulations. The difference is, the big difference between Badiou and dialectical theology is Badiou, being a materialist, he's an atheist. He says very clearly where he disagrees with Kierkegaard is that this event is something that we realize within ourselves. We achieve our eternalization, our infinitude, by a resolve. In that sense, he's very similar to Heidegger on that point. And that's also where Bultmann disagrees with Heidegger explicitly. He says, Bultmann's main disagreement with all philosophy, but Heidegger in particular, is we can't accept the terms of salvation realized on those terms, right? It's not something that we have the ability to just resolve out of our own resources. We can't just determine.
Well, I really find like one of the helpful parts of that is like, you're not your own solution, right? Like, and I think that's one of the things that liberal theology and now evangelical theology has turned Christianity into, is that it's a narrative where like you have within you the solution for the ills, like whatever it is, could be faithfulness or what. I mean, there's a certain optimism to having a good old, really distorted recognition of how shitty humans are, right? Like,
are we talking about reclaiming Augustine?
well, it doesn't, I don't know, just because of how much baggage Augustine comes with.
How about Calvin?
No, but no, what's being resisted is that you're not the solution to your own problem. And I think that's important to hear for a lot of progressive Christians and a lot of just progressive activists and stuff, because a lot of the way they experience themselves in the world, just at least from people that message me and stuff in the podcast, is like especially if you come out of an evangelical space and your faith becomes more focused on praxis, justice, and all that kind of stuff, it's easy to get completely burnt out and to start seeing individuals who instantiate a systemic problem as the problem themselves. And so you start feeling, you experience yourself as more enlightened or better or more holy or whatever. And one of I think the best gifts Christian theology does is it actually thinks that every worship service involves a prayer of confession that everyone has to say. And there's a certain realism about recognizing, we can have poetic dreams of the coming reign of God, but still, like, you're not your own solution. And that actually gives you permission to be honest about your own brokenness and complicity and systemically boundedness and all sorts of oppression, but also recognizing that grace creates an opportunity for transformation that it's very tempting for progressives to, commodify or feel overly responsible for because you're unaware of what you're working with. This
reminds me of something that Helmut Gollwitzer said.
No way.
As most things do. Because
if anybody on the podcast is there a book that someone could read about this? Like,
yeah, interestingly enough, there is a book that somebody could read about Helmut Gollwitzer. I happen to write it. It's called Our God Loves Justice. And if there's often sales and things if you want to try to catch that. But Gollwitzer, a lot of one of the real critical moments in his own theological development was encountering the newly published lectures of Luther's lectures on Romans. Mm-hmm. And so the doctrine of justification that Luther articulates there was very central for Gollwitzer. And one of the ways that it played out was his awareness that, the phrase, but for the grace of God, there go I. So because of that deep awareness of the doctrine of justification, though, as you said, not being the solution to your own problem, that really, served as kind of a fuel for Gollwitzer's remaining in the church and working within the church as long as he possibly could, even though the church is so often a very conservative institution. And he says that the thing that kept him from that reflex of looking down on church folks is because it's all justification. You're not the solution to your own problem, and therefore, if you feel as though you're more enlightened or you go along in this progressive way, like you were talking about, it has nothing to do with you, and so it also has nothing to do with them, and it's ultimately all about God's grace.
But it's also precisely for that reason that I think dialectical theology sees grace or sees, forms of Christian faithfulness outside of the church entirely. Yep. And part of what I've tried to articulate in my work is this unconsciousness of grace or unconsciousness of Christianity, that it's beyond our conscious reflective existence.
And if anybody's interested, that's in a book called The God Who Saves. Right.
Yes.
By David Congdon.
Right.
So you should definitely buy that one too.
And that title is intended to be somewhat elusive, because it's part of the point of that book is that salvation doesn't occur where we expect it to occur.
Yeah.
Where we think it's supposed to occur. Precisely because we are not the solution to our problem. That means that the solutions can happen in places that we don't necessarily consciously, intentionally try to realize them. I mean, that's part of what happens with so much of Christian piety and Christianity, is that we think that by going to this space, by participating in these rituals and liturgies, we are thereby closer to realizing the goal, closer to achieving the ends towards which we were called and created. But part of what I think dialectical theology is trying to articulate is that we might find those sites of grace. The event might be located outside of where we expect it to occur, and therefore outside of where we're intentionally trying to achieve it.
Are we talking about the radical kenosis of Christian theological privilege?
Sure. Yeah, I have to think about that one. The K word gets used so often in theology nowadays.
I know. I was just throwing it in there.
I have to, I've now developed this. I've developed this sort of a gut reaction to it where I just immediately recoil.
I was just reading Ruther on the kenosis of the patriarchy and Jesus, so it's stuck in my head right now.
Oh, then I can sign on board with that for sure. Yeah.
The kenosis of the patriarchy. Oh, that's a prayer that's lingering. So how in growing up in more evangelical context, going through theological education, coming out and such, how has your relationship to your scholarship and to your own practice of piety changed over time?
That's a loaded question. That's
it's also very vague.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I sort of consider myself to be, even though I was confirmed Episcopalian 2 years ago, and I do identify myself with that community, and I find myself attracted to that form of piety. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, I probably would have to categorize myself with the religious disaffiliated in some ways. I think a lot of my theological work over the last few years has been an attempt to provide a theology for the nuns, to provide a theology for those who don't necessarily identify with a particular tradition or theological community or faith community, but nevertheless sense that there's something beyond their immediate given existence that is inexplicable, but also but has a real impact and eventfulness in their existence, right? So I don't, in that sense, I think theology, for me, my academic work and my personal piety, in some ways, they don't align always, but that misalignment is part of my own kind of complex vocation now in terms of being kind of operating outside the bounds of any sort of community. I don't write Episcopalian theology. I don't write, theology for a particular community or tradition necessarily, but I in some way that liminal space of identity is partly where I want to theologize out of.
Well, I mean, even the way you describe that, like my experience working at a very large UCC church in LA, is that most of the people that even were elders and tithed would have said they were religiously disaffiliated. They just happened to find a church, but they wouldn't want to use the Christian label. And, as a theologian who's a church planter kid from the South, I'm like, why? Like you give money and show up all the time. But I do think there is for those of us who had much more positive experiences in the church, like me, my wife who did not, like there's something that's getting said that's unrelated to your assessment of God in religious disaffiliation. And I think in America, it's saying something more specific, that radical, like a kind of radical notion of the event or grace, disrupts the identities that kind of culture dominant Protestantism cherished, right? But it does so on behalf of God. So it's like doubly intriguing as opposed to just, complaining about it. But yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot recently. I gave a survey to, the 800 people at church, and I think it was 42% check none. And you're like, y'all go here. But they were like, yeah, but on the surveys when you check Christian.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is very disappointing to Bill Maher because he thinks every time someone checks none, they agree with him. But, like, I was like, what is it? And I wonder, and this is maybe a question that about y'all's friendship might play out. Like, I'm probably much more like you in that, like,
he's pointing at me, by the way.
Yeah, Travis, where my natural intuition is to a much more conservative position. And I'm like happy. Like when we pick churches, I tell Alicia, I'm like, neither one of us are working in church right now. Wherever you want to go is fine. I enjoy it all. Like, I can enjoy almost anything because I know she won't go to any crazy place, but I was like, it could be like progressive Pentecostal if you want chants and shit. That's fine. You want hymns, worship. I don't care. Like, I preach at churches all the time because of the podcast. I like look at the church. I'm like, this is great. No one has to be here, and they're deciding to be here. And this is beautiful. And she's like, no, you don't understand the kind of damage these places could do.
It's certainly the case that I would not say that I ever had a bad experience with the church. I know it's shaped me in all kinds of harmful ways at a subconscious level, but in terms of feeling oppressed by it, and
your smile.
Right. It didn't stop my smile. But I mean, it also helps that I'm a white dude, right? I'm kind of the demographic that it's designed to, affirm. So that plays into this. But, my parents were also always deeply involved in church, and they were church musicians. And so my brothers and I grew up playing music in church and being part of that and part of the worship wars and all of that kind of stuff. And so I can remember to this day, the day that I figured out that not all adults have it together. In fact, no adults really have it together. But I mean, and it was in the context of, intra-church disagreements and things. So I grew up very much with no illusions about what goes on Sundays.
Oh yeah. No. Yeah.
As a, your own background, you saw that all too. So I wouldn't say that the evangelical church or whatever ever damaged me, but I also had this very kind of cynical or jaded view of it, from the operations side, as it will. And so, I mean, and I spent a lot of time and energy when I was younger trying to be pious, because that's what you're supposed to do, and it just never worked for me. And so at this point, you talk about my piety, I would, if you mean traditional piety, I probably don't have any. Even
you just went to a Schleiermacher section. Like, there's
Schleiermacher's interesting.
Yeah, but he has a very broad definition of piety.
That's true. But like, if you think about traditional forms and practices of piety, it's like, I don't go in for that very much at all, except showing up for church on Sundays and praying the Lord's Prayer. That's about as far as it gets. So
I just would like everyone to know I read the Bible and pray every day.
We know, Trip. You're a much better Christian than the rest of us.
Y'all are much more orthodox.
I
don't know.
Secret as Jesus commanded.
We might have to have an argument about which one of us is more orthodox.
No, you won't even tell us things you don't believe when you grow up.
I didn't say an argument on mic.
Oh, okay.
No, I mean, what's interesting about
all I know is he convinced you the resurrection's not physical. That's it.
Before I'm done, though, I just want, from my own position, it's like all of those different forms of piety, they can all have their place for different people depending on their own personality and their own inclinations. And they can all be different ways that people are shaped to be better human beings. And that's fine. And they just aren't really for me. So
oddly enough, my entire goal in asking that question was for one of you to be like, well, dialectical theology as a certain way of cultivating hermeneutics. And so you have a certain relationship to reality and existence, and you could cultivate a pious relationship to all sorts of things, because anything could be the situation where the event happens or something like that. That's what I was expecting.
Well,
Well, you asked it personally, though. So
I know, but because,
Well, I mean, for me,
that's friends.
That was, I grew, so it was interesting that I grew up with a very naive view, not jaded view about Sundays. I thought everything was great. Everything was perfect, and it wasn't until I think I got really almost to college, I think, that
bless your heart,
I suddenly discovered how, I was really insulated, but I discovered poetry and art, and that for me, I even as a child, even though I thought Sundays were great and that church was all a good place, I never experienced a spiritual experience like that. I never had a deep piety ever. For me, those were always through literature from a young age, and through, extra ecclesial forms of encounter.
I think part of it is my parents, even though they're Baptist church planners, are both on the mystical side. So like that, my dad was like, I like to pray in silence on the top of a tree. Like, so he would go sit in a tree on the top of it all the time. Like, so to me, I was like, obviously that's what, I mean, my dad's a church planner, like that Christians obviously go in nature and pray. And I remember mom going like, the most sacred time is at our knitting group when after you start knitting for a while, your bodies start moving together. And then all of a sudden people that haven't been able to share about their week start sharing. And I was like, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so whenever people have these real sacred secular divide things, I always hear them like, oh, is that what piety means? I just thought it was just.
No, my problem is I make the joke, I just don't have an inner life. So.
You are like a brain on a swivel or something like.
It's pretty close to it sometimes.
So,
I'm sure I'm suppressing and repressing all kinds of shit.
What time's David supposed to go to something?
I'm good for an hour.
I thought
we editing this out, or we leaving our discussion of schedules into the recording?
I don't know yet. Depends on how authentic. We already mentioned Heidegger, and he loves authenticity. Every time you say that in front of an academic, then they have to decide if they feel obligated to correct what you're saying. So this is a question about Badu, just because one of the things I liked about the way he describes the event when he's doing the whole explaining it symbolically bit is when he talks about the void being so he's doing set theory, which just think of a bunch of variables. Mm-hmm. And then there's a bracket around the variables that are acknowledged, affirmed by the system. And so these variables, this collective, which is an arbitrary collection of multiplicity, because there's no, at the base, it's a chaosmos of sorts. I don't know if you use that. That's probably too teleological for him to say. But there's just like sheer multiplicity, right? And so there's, there's a set. And he talks about acting as one. And so you look at the logic of the one that's kind of like, this is true. You only relate to it as a solid entity. And then the void is not the revelation that the truth in it's wrong. It's just that it's not final in one. And so the void is this blurring in a sense of like the bracket on a set. And all it's doing is letting it know you're a giant myth. Right? And so the liberating thing is just that the one doesn't get to function that way. And when you brought up, it started to make me think like, how do you see that in a sense, like structural demythologizing in Badu connecting to the demythologizing in, Bultmann, because people mishear Bultmann's demythologizing because they're worried their grandmother might hear what they're saying, and as opposed to hearing what he's trying to get at.
I mean, what you're bringing up a bit in Badu though is a bit of a tension disagreement I have regarding where to locate theology with respect to Badu. So Ken Reinhout in his article on Badu, which is very good, but he argues that we could locate God in the null, in that kind of null set. And I don't want to go that route. Part of what's going on there is the null set operates on the side of being. That's on the being ontology side of Badu.
So it needs to be on the event side.
I want to put it on the event side. So I actually look at Logics of Worlds, which is his phenomenology, which for me is the more interesting work. I mean, being an event is brilliant. But Logics of Worlds is really where he theorizes what happens phenomenologically with this event. How does it actually shape our existence? And so it's an existential work, and also in the Second Manifesto, that's also where he does this work, which I think is also very important. But in those works, I would want to put revelation or God somewhere, whatever category you want to put, on the event side. And so there, it's not the null, but it's actually this, what he calls the trace, or this upsurge of a trace that, kind of arises, in the moment and kind of shocks the system of the situation. And then persons like ourselves, we latch onto this event or this trace. And then we are then tasked with mobilizing a community or people around this trace. The trace itself is ephemeral. It disappears. But then what's left in its wake are people who have been touched by this encounter and are then in a sense, called into existence to be faithful to it.
Was he reading Barth's second epistle to the Romans?
I mean, that's effectively what's going on. I mean, that's actually, there was actually so Karl Raschke argues that he wonders whether or not Badiou was reading Bultmann. Then I kind of pick up on that and go from there. But, I think there's a sense in which, even if he wasn't actually reading Bultmann or Barth, he probably could have been, or maybe was implicitly.
The first chapter of his book on Paul would have been better if he had read
That's true.
Bultmann or Barth. But it does work really.
Yeah, I think Logics of Worlds helps correct some things in the Paul book that I don't like, which I think could have been done better. The Paul book, I think, represents his thinking at the being and event stage. And then I think there's a bit of a shift into the second manifesto and Logics of Worlds, where his thought gets a little more, nuanced with respect to the event. But anyway.
So when you think of, the event that elicits faith in a dialectical situation, what makes the faith Christian, and what is the event's relationship to the contingencies of history?
I mean, yeah, that's the big question, right? I think part of what I'm attempting to do is explain or offer an account of how it is Christian. It's certainly not Christian in any sort of traditional sense that it's not Christian by virtue of continuing a certain continuity of doctrine. So I'm rejecting that account of continuity, where insofar as it maintains a rule of faith or some sort of doctrinal propositional norm, therefore it's Christian. Kevin Hector's work on Schleiermacher argues for kind of a repetition of Jesus's way of being, his practice. So if you go on in the same way as Jesus, then you are Christian. So I'm rejecting those kinds of accounts because they presume a kind of linear historical continuity of the church, where as long as you're part of the visible church, you're Christian. And that's what I'm resisting. What I would want to put forward as dialectical theology is to say that there's a kind of unconscious account of faith. And Bonhoeffer actually has this idea in his letters, in his work, that, it poses a question to us. That is, perhaps we need to find what counts as Christian is not something that's consciously available to us, that perhaps we can see things that are quote unquote Christian that are outside those bounds. And so the question then is what defines that? I'm open to a variety of possibilities here. I don't think there's any one single account of what counts as Christian that is universally normative. I'm open to a variety of possibilities here. What's important to me is that it's an event. Now, how we flesh out what that event is, I think, is part of what I think the task of theology is all about. We engage in dialogue with multiple people and we try to think about this. The idea I've put forward, I don't want to claim that mine is definitive of dialectical theology by any stretch of the imagination, but my idea is that let's take this notion of Christ dying and God abandonment. Let's take this account of abandonment further and say, insofar as we ourselves experience this negation or this loss or this being placed outside of ourselves, to use that language, insofar as we experience abandonment by the world or abandonment by God, we are existing in that moment in a space that repeats Christ's own death and God abandonment. And so in that repetition of that space, that's a Christian space, so to speak. So that gives me a norm or a way by which we can then identify places in the world in which people are existing outside of themselves or being placed outside of themselves, placed in a position of abandonment or a place of divine silence, basically. And in that silence, God is present. So would you say that content-wise, the revelation is more of the individual's disposition to the world at a moment versus God's disposition to the world? To use Chavez's language, that's paradoxically identical. But yes.
Well, sure. I stole it from Bultmann.
Yes.
Yeah, but I only asked just because I think there's one of the things the dialectical theology does, especially to students that are new to it, is it uses like Pauline language like a champ. And
Yes.
yet, especially, if Americans don't get to tell us what Bart thought, then God's self-testimony is an encounter, there's not content from the encounter that's transferable to others that will encounter the holy later. Does that make sense? Like, I don't know the right way of asking the question. I just am always, to me, the biggest difficulty of dialectical thought is that the history of Israel is a story that assumes that in the event there's an encounter with another, but the other in whom you encounter, the holy mystery is more clear because of the progress of that relationship over time than not. And Bultmann seems to think that's not ideal, or that Jesus is the fruit of the ongoing history of God in relationship to history of Israel, is that he's born out of it, not this very strict break-in structure that the event could have just as well happened with someone else who died abandoned. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like,
sure.
So at what point how do you see the role of the content of Revelation playing if it's just the form you're looking at and not the content itself?
That's a good question. I mean, so there is a disagreement here between dialectical theology and salvation history accounts. So salvation history accounts want to find a continuity of narrative, a continuity of history, in which there's a telos, an end that we're all moving towards. And dialectical theology is more punctiliar, more inbreaking, more apocalyptic in that sense. Mm-hmm. That being said, I wouldn't want to construe dialectical theology as always and everywhere, some sort of nuclear bomb that's kind of eviscerating the historical realities of life and the progress and the continuity of existence. It's not a denial of history. That's often how it's construed. I think part of what is important here is affirming the history is important, but there is a distinction here between the content of the history and the content of the norm or the kerygma, however you want to define it, that is what counts as authentic or Christian. So in other words, yes, historically, it's conceivable that someone else could have been the one who is identified as the Christ. What's important is that the norm or the criterion for what is theological, what's Christian, is it's paradoxically related to that event. It is both Jesus, but it's also not directly identifiable with Jesus.
To a certain extent, you're riffing on the late medieval distinction that you get especially in Scotus thought between the Dei Potentia Absoluta and the Dei Potentia Ordinata.
I had that in mind the whole time.
I figured you did.
Oh my goodness. Y'all should team teach.
But also, I mean, going back to the comments you made about the Tanakh, about the Jewish scriptures, I mean, once you start, again, getting behind the canonical form and looking at the historical development of those texts, it starts to look very different, and you begin to see how the prophetic tradition is actually the tradition that's out in front of the development of those texts. And then you get the other traditions, which are very much royal legitimizing traditions that are taking its cues from the prophetic and then trying to reconfigure them to support various versions of the status quo. And as you go through the different redactions of those texts, those elements that the prophetic are bringing in, which are looking at a much more radical and world overturning kind of deity, get muted, so that I mean, even just a sort of flat appeal to quote unquote Old Testament as continuity, I think that's just one way of reading those texts.
I mean, could you put it this way, that salvation historical accounts are just reified, frozen accounts of this existential encounter read backwards into history?
I'm down with it.
Yeah, I mean that's in some ways what I think is going on. I mean, a lot of salvation historical. It's not as if this is read off the face of history, as if this was actually developing that way. These are retrospectively narrated accounts of the history from the perspective of a certain account of salvation, and all that I think we are trying to say from dialectical theology is that a different account of salvation is necessary, which then rereads the history differently.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
Because people forget that these are retroactive in their operation, right? And they just, it's assumed that this is some kind of demonstrable, prior to.
Yeah, there's a reason why dialectical theology arose out of form criticism.
Yeah.
I mean, the form critical scholarship was looking at these texts and trying to kind of look back and then kind of reconstruct the development of these texts historically to see how these communities put these texts together in a certain way, that their faith commitments to Jesus as the Christ then retrospectively colored how they remembered him and his teachings and his life and his history, right?
Well, I mean, all the way down into, assuming the synoptics, plenty of people were able to encounter the second person of the Trinity and not confess him,
Right.
Like, and so I wonder if there's a way in which Christianity, or at least theology, kind of exists on different registers, and what you're talking about is a much more existential register. Mm-hmm. And then there's like a historical register that is also an ongoing conversation and shaped by people's existential encounter, because surprisingly, a lot of people did not write about the Exodus that weren't the beneficiaries of it. Yeah. And the same thing about Jesus, right? Like, you have like 6 sentences of historical data, and half of them are like, they're really weird. But they're really good for taking care of the poor, so we just not beat them. So I do think there's a historical and an existential register, and then there a metaphysical one of sorts that changes how you read history and how you read the self. Yeah. And theologians tend to be much more interested in one of those than the other.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And so, like, I know I'm naturally interested in the metaphysical ones, but that's just because, like, if I could imagine getting to a place I didn't believe certain things and not being a Christian, and I would just be philosophically religious.
You Trip.
No, I know, and I would be like, oh, but then I could, anyway. So how do you see and you don't have to use those words, but I feel like Christology is one of those doctrines where you have knobs on all 3 registers getting turned at all times. Mm-hmm. And I can read someone's Christology and like it, but would never have aligned the knobs up the way they did on those different registers. And dialectical theology, for me, always comes across as the right type of on the existential register. Like, you don't get to opt out. You have to make a fucking decision. And this encounter is not about your grandma, and it's not about how your friends feel about you. Like, you're supposed to give yourself to something, and you don't even know what the hell you're doing it with. And this might be the worst decision you've ever made in your life, but at least you'll have made a damn decision, right?
That's true.
Then you're like, I've been reading quantum mechanics and thinking about divine action. And you're like, how are they related? I know they are because they're all in my head. But I feel like radical, like the kind of like radical impetus of faith is on that existential register. And AAR, I'm reminded, this is why I said all this, so that when I meet people who have 0 register on the existential thing and talk about theology, they just piss me off. That's what I've decided. Wait,
tell us what you really think, Trip.
Like, if you're sitting there talking about God and you have, because of your tradition or whatever, very strong a priori commitments you've never considered wrong on the metaphysical level, you are so confident about the historical level that you footnote a certain British New Testament scholar who's very confident that Jesus was self-consciously the second person of the Trinity because
I have no idea who you're talking about.
Second Esdras and fourth Maccabee or something. And you're like, obviously he's like incarnating Israel, second person of the Trinity. Get over it. Maybe. And then you get around the existential side, and I'm like, I just don't, nothing about you communicates you've taken any of this seriously. And I'm irritated. And I could have liked the paper. I could have been like, that's interesting. But I don't like you. Because I think theologians have to have an existential register. I don't like nothing's up for grabs.
Are you saying hate the sinner, love the sin at this point? Is it?
No, I don't hate them. I just think they should have a different vocation.
I agree entirely. It's, let's just name some names here. Like St. Andrews. Like, the University of St. Andrews embodies both of the problems here. They both have Tom Wright.
David's in a kicking ass. And
I am
taking
ready
names
to
mood
just-
this
This is
weekend.
endorsed by
Let's just-
Travis
let's just name
McMaken, Linwood.
God damn it, Trip.
So they have both Tom Wright and they have the Analytic Theology Institute there, which represent the poles of the historical and the metaphysical on the extremes of those two ends,
Yeah.
right? And what
Exorbitantly confident.
As you may imagine, dialectical theology has serious questions to put to both.
right,
Of these.
so we had some disagreements, and I think both those sides lose the existential almost entirely in to some degree or another. I mean, they might put it in there, but it's a subordinate or minimal category. So yeah, I mean, I would say our theological approach. We have some interest in we definitely have interest in the historical, maybe some interest in the metaphysical or not at all. But the existential is very, very important. And I think, so like for Bultmann, for example,
Metaphysical is a very, very, very far down
it
third.
depends
for
on
me.
how you define metaphysics. Yeah. But it's
Crystals. I thought that's what y'all were talking about. Crystals, right? I mean, y'all are the ones with the collection in your hotel room.
I'll sell you some essential
Damn it,
oils.
Trip.
But like Bultmann has a big disagreement with
Scholarships.
with the historicists, right? This is his big thing is that you can only do history if you're existentially affected by this, by what you're reading and studying and researching.
Are there even two different words for history?
There are.
What are they?
So, yes. So Bultmann would accuse the Tom Wrights of the world of trying to champion history. And, whereas he would say we need to do Geschichte, that we have to have an encounter with history that is existentially effective. It encounters us. We are shaped by this experience, by this reality. And so we can't understand history if we aren't existentially affected by it.
And perhaps history is not possible, and people just confuse their own Geschichte with history.
When you confuse your Geschichte. And all I know is you are in St. Andrews, someone's Geschichte got out of whack, and
My
there's
apologies.
British accents.
There are good folks at St. Andrews. I don't mean to.
That's it, David. Walk it back.
But it is symbolic here of trends. I mean, and they are not by any means unique here. This is a academy-wide issue regarding how do we approach theology and religion and history. I mean, Pauline studies right now is divided between those who think that we should just analyze Paul as a historical person, right, versus Paul as a theological thinker who has contemporary relevance. And that's an ongoing divide within New Testament research, for example. And that's just one example of many, right? That's just indicative of a larger issue with what's the role of existence and existential, our effectiveness in our academic work. There's a problem here insofar as, I mean, on one hand, I do want to say that, we can analyze some of these figures like Barton Bultmann in a, purely historical way. But the ongoing relevance of their theology is one that challenges the neutrality of theology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, so one of the things I find odd every time I go to AAR is there's a what the gap feels like between the church and the academy. When you're in the academy, it seems much more creepier to me than when I'm in the church, because every church I've worked at has a lot of intellectuals in it from all sorts of disciplines. If you talk to like the physics professor at UCLA, it was at my church, like she has thoughts about religion and science, and you ask school teachers and think about like, how do you see your faith connected to education and caring for kids? Like everyone else can do it, but at the AAR, people that freaking train ministers are sitting there in a room looking embarrassed that they might have to talk about the fact that they there's millions of people have donated to endowments to give them jobs to train ministers. And then they get asked a question like, what do you think of God? And they're like, no. That's not how I'd frame the question. And then they reorganize the question and they lecture people. There's this, if we are simultaneously part of a community, but also the ones reflecting on it. I don't quite get the dismissiveness in the academy of practitioners of any religion. And it's odd at the academy because it's mostly Christians that get sweepingly dismissed. I've not seen any people giggle because a Muslim woman's describing what it's like to be a Muslim in Iran who cultivates secret practice of pieties around Muhammad's daughter, which I said in that paper. It was awesome. No one giggled. But if we were in a thing and they were like, well, these Presbyterians in Wichita who started this thing, we were looking at it I don't know even know what to do with that, but it just seems odd that certain actual embodied practices of religion are jokes to people. And even those that come out of those traditions don't acknowledge the role it played for them to become interested in it. Like, how do you see that tension existing for those of us that
the dynamic you're describing, especially in the AAR, I think it has a lot to do with the AAR specifically because it's trying to straddle two different academic worlds. It's trying to be a place where you can do theology, and it's also trying to be a place where you can do religious studies. Mm-hmm. And as disciplines, they're just constructed very differently. And I think a lot of the times what you get in the back half of the 20th century and now in theology in North America, as religious studies has developed, is theologians trying to sound like they're doing religious studies, even if they're not. And I think that can be part of what leads to the disconnect between church and academy. And, part of the issue is the way in which is how theology has become theory laden. And this is not to say that theory is bad. I happen to like theory and it's very illuminating. But then you have to, there's another step if you're going to engage with that theory to communicating in the context of the church. And so it's easy to show up to AAR and put different theorists in conversation with different historical theologians and come up with interesting things that your peers will recognize as interesting. It's another thing to show up and teach Sunday school, or like I do and teach 18-year-olds. And so, I mean, for me personally, the issue is always to try to communicate as clearly as possible about, as you were saying earlier, the existential register of what's going on. And that's just where my attention is focused. And so more power to all these folks at AAR who can engage in the complicated theoretical discussions and know their theologians well enough to represent that well and put them in the conversation with theorists that they understand. That's all awesome and thought provoking. But I think if you don't have people doing that translation work, you just increase the gap between what happens on Sundays and what happens at AAR on Sundays.
And I don't really think that most academics would laugh at papers about piety, for most Christians.
Because especially if you're working from within a religious studies approach, I mean, that's just an exercise in ethnography. And,
right.
That's what you should be doing.
Yeah. But insofar as there is a sense of, a lack of interest in some of those narratives and those stories. It's understandable if we're just saturated with it in our culture, and
honestly, I wonder if it's a holdover from, cause you were talking earlier about the registers of metaphysics and the existential and the historical. I wonder if it's some kind of deeply sensed embarrassment by those who are working much more in the metaphysical and historical registers, than anything else, and trying to do theology in a way that's ultimately not existentially meaningful.
I used to.
But now I'm making big sweeping claims that I'd probably.
No, I think you're right about the embarrassment.
It's almost as bad as St. Andrews, right? You know what I mean?
Not quite though.
The best way of reading works.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with St. Andrews.
Analytical interpretations of works of love. I went to that session. It was spectacular.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Analytical I think love is the last thing I would want analytically investigated. But that's just me.
Yeah. Analytical Kierkegaard is not what we want. But But I went to the Logos Institute once, which is where they do analytical theology at Notre Dame, and there was a talk, and one of these analytic, more on the philosopher side than the theological side, in response to Billy Abraham's plenary, which was very good. And part of Billy Abraham's point was that we need to retain the existential. We need to retain the existential dimension of theology. We can't just do metaphysics. And the graduate student stood up and said, I don't care about the existential. I don't care about that. I only care about the metaphysics.
See, and
Billy Abraham said, you're not a theologian, you're a philosopher.
Nice.
He said, sit down.
And
I think that's a really helpful distinction.
And you said earlier, I'm more the historian. It just takes me back to the Reformation and the tradition of people like Erasmus, and then on the Reformation side, like Calvin, who are just, complaining about scholastic theology to no end because it's all logic and no rhetoric. And, you lose something very important when you lose the rhetorical, and you cease to be able to analyze what these theological claims from the rhetorical perspective. It's not just what are they telling you in terms that you can set up as a syllogism, but what are they actually doing to the person who's hearing these claims, and what kind of action has been done to the people who make the claims. And it's that kind of existential element that so quickly gets lost.
Yeah, and my frustration more is with on the historical side, which is where I think, and not to pick up too much on Tom Wright, although I will. Part of they don't want to deny the existential. They have a strong existential dimension, but they think the existential.
No, actually, Tom's best books are when that's what he writes about.
Exactly, precisely. But the issue here is he thinks the existential arises naturally out of the history. He thinks that if you just do the history, you'll get to the existential. And I think that's the wrong way around. I think you have to have the existential to understand and appreciate the history in that way. You can't, part of it is an apologetics issue. I mean, he wants to say, if we just do good history, quote unquote, we will all conclude that this event happened, resurrection, and then we will be compelled to recognize and join the faith, right? And
which makes no sense to me. There were plenty of people walking around hanging out with Jesus that had absolutely no inkling of what orthodoxy would later define about him and so on. It's just it's not like Jesus walked around with a halo that you could point to, right? So why would you think that history is going to deliver you something you could point to in a
and if it did, would it really be the answer you're looking for? I think it's the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, like if it's demanded by history, then it costs you nothing to give way to it, right? Like. And Jesus is like, blessed are those who aren't offended. And then regularly the disciples get it wrong anyway. Like to me, one of the things about the New Testament that brings the existential element up is the disciples and demons get the label correct. Like, you're the Christ. Mm-hmm. But the content of who the Christ is the debate. And they resist him being the one that goes to Jerusalem to face down the powers. And so I think, like, when the historical or the metaphysical or the tradition, any of those things, they miss the existential part is that, like, you don't stay out the Mount of Transfiguration. You turn to Jerusalem, or you realize begging to be beside him when he comes into his kingdom's a bad idea, or, that kind of thing. So that existential element, in the Enlightenment, I think gets really drowned out by discussions around history and such, though they're important. I think to a lot of people who are in congregations who have the existential experience, and then they want to know, but can I be intelligent Christian that reads the history of religions and knows that the Bible's not inerrant, or that their other religions don't suck, or I can be a scientist? And so I feel like if in the Enlightenment we shifted the center of gravity to the metaphysical and the historical, and then obviously the existential part comes around, like once you get the prolegomity or systematic done, it all works out. That dialectical theology, and really what like Bonhoeffer's doing at the end of his work and stuff, is this shift, like history and metaphysics and all this thing isn't just needs to be there, right? Like, so he gives that line in Letters and Papers where, like, God and history are not these like weighted terms that demand a response. You get to this kind of secular context or whatever, and faith isn't something you have to do, it's something you get to do. and it's not like compelled and necessary. So like Christianity is more than necessary. That kind of concept I find really attractive, because then there's like, unless you're existentially engaged, just don't even worry about it. And it's not like you're going to other people going, you have a giant deficit in your existence, and it's what I have. But you can say, this community in this place offers a way of being in the world, and I can give a testimony to what it's meant to me. But it doesn't come with an a priori judgment to the world and to the person. And I think that is, like, if I was thinking of the things a lot of people want to leave behind, that's it. That to be faithful is to show up, and until they're like you, there's a problem with them. And until the culture's the one you want, there's a problem with it. Until the world is, or till the conclusions of historians and metaphysicians, until they agree with you, they're in deficit. Like, that's just ugly. Yeah. And it's like, Jesus literally never treated anyone that way. And he had plenty of opportunities, but somehow, like, the church feels so insecure, it needs to say its truth demands those things. And in doing so, I feel like one of the elements that you were describing is that's actually a defense mechanism to genuine discipleship. Because you can spend all this time sounding and acting Christian without being a follower of Christ. And that following and that embodying is not even determined ultimately by the boundaries of the church or of the label.
I mean, so much of the interest in metaphysics and in history right now is for purely apologetic reasons. I mean, when I was at IVP, a lot of our books were all about apologetics. They were either historical apologetics or this metaphysical apologetics, and trying to precisely to address what I think you hit nail on the head there when you mentioned about, you have the existential side already, but we need to like defend it and make sure that it's justifiable. The rationality of that existential faith. So and there's this deep insecurity that maybe it's not justifiable, maybe it's not rational, that's not reasonable, and so we need to shore it up with arguments from metaphysics and history to give us those guarantees, that security of our existential existence in faith. And so part of dialectical theology is about embracing that insecurity, embracing the lack of guarantees. In fact, being willing to abide in that insecure place is precisely in some ways how I would define faith. And that's going to be very, very uncomfortable for those who think they have to find a stable foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is the heart of the divide there. And so my disagreement with the historicists or the metaphysical analytic types is that I think that those exercises might be very interesting and rationally, provocative and have good arguments, but ultimately the basis, the motivation for engaging in that work is problematic for me. And is perhaps leading us astray from what I think what existence and faith is really about. And that's part of the point of what we're doing. I mean, but yeah, I mean, I think embracing the secularity also is what you point out with Bonhoeffer. I mean, that's an important point for both of us in terms of understanding the secularity of Christianity. I mean, Bonhoeffer inspired a number of folks, including Ronald Gregor Smith, Gogarten, and other folks to discuss what a secular faith would look like. That's a faith without guarantees, a faith without security in the world that embraces that insecurity and operates within it.
So, could y'all agree on I'm interested in dialectical theology top 5 reading list? But you can't pick your own books because everyone has already gotten them. So,
which books would those be again, Trip?
Well, obviously not the Big Bultmann book because it's no longer available. But you can get the little one.
That's right. And
The God Who Saves and Loves Justice.
I would say, that a lot of the really good books out there are no longer in print also. There are some really good books from 50s and 60s that are worth finding.
I mean, Smith's Secular Christianity.
It's a fantastic book. Well worth reading. If you can find a used copy of it, pick it up.
Smith's first name?
Ronald Gregor Smith.
Yeah. Ronald Gregor Smith.
it's a tough thing.
What is theology by Bultmann?
What is theology?
I would say evangelical theology by Barth. If you got to pick something from Barth.
I might go with Romans, but evangelical theology.
I mean, Romans is so hard.
Yeah, it is hard. That's true. It's not introductictory reading. Travis actually tasked me about a year ago with putting together a syllabus for dialectical
Do we have
theology.
that yet?
I don't have it yet. It's staring me on my computer to finish that up. So I think those two works, you need a Bultmann and a Barth book, but,
I'm tempted to say Schleiermacher's speeches.
I would put Schleiermacher's speeches in that list. I think I'd probably put something like Marcella Althaus Reed's Indecent Theology on there even. I mean, she's not in the orbit explicitly of dialectical theology, but I think she's doing the kind of work that I would want to see done today by people in dialectical theology.
Does Jungel count?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
God, the Mystery of the World was my favorite one.
Yeah.
Like that book.
Also a very, very difficult book. I wouldn't recommend to new readers, but you're right. No, I mean, that book is incredibly important and certainly does most of what we're talking about today.
Dalfort's new book, Radical Theology, which is essentially dialectical theology called Rad.
Yes.
Cause it's not what people think of when they think of radical theology, cause it's actual theology. Badum ching. That was a high quality joke.
That was a freebie, huh?
I know. No, I have to fit one jab in towards radical theology in every podcast episode. There's a group that hates listens. And if I don't make comments, they can complain about what are they going to do. Jungel doesn't have a whole lot of easy reading.
No, he doesn't. I mean, that's the second list on the syllabus.
Yeah.
You do the first works initially, and then you get to the advanced reading. I think Caputo probably could be on that list. I mean, some of his more recent work I hesitate a bit, but I think that would fall within the orbit. It provides an entryway into some of these things.
His The Folly of God, which is a very, radical reading of Tillich, is pretty good. Something
from Kierkegaard probably should go on this list. I mean, that's probably an easy one to add.
What's your favorite Kierkegaard to read?
It's a tough one.
While he's thinking about Kierkegaard, Tillich's Socialist Decision.
Yeah.
That's a good book.
I mean, for new readers, I mean, probably Works of Love is probably a good entryway.
We're way past 5 though.
I know. The first time I taught a class after I did my PhD, I was like, I'm just gonna figure out how to get philosophical fragments on here just cause I had it assigned in 5 classes over the course of from undergrad through PhD program. And I'm like, I want to read this in a room and watch people who hadn't read it before. Cause I remembered the second time I was assigned it, I was like, that's what this book's about. I read it already in undergrad, and then I read it again later, and then eventually in the Kierkegaard seminar, I was like, yeah, I think I got it this time. Where you get the basic Kierkegaard and get the stage, and then you start getting to some of the subtleties in it, and you're like, oh, this is good. But one of my professors used to read all the little short stories out of Kierkegaard, and he would read them at the beginning of class and tear up, and we were always like. I was like, I want to come up with a way to creep people out, some undergrads out, reading Kierkegaard, where they're like, that makes someone this excited? And
see, my entryway was through poetry. For me, it was R.S. Thomas as a Welsh poet priest. I think reading his works was my entryway into dialectical theology before I ever read Barth. That was, and Czesław Miłosz, his poetry, which is also that does a lot of the similar kinds of moves. Even theologically. And he's kind of a lapsed Polish Catholic, but, But so I think there are other avenues besides just reading traditional philosophical theological works.
Speaking of lapsed Catholics, Terry Eagleton.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
He's cool. Well, thank you for hanging out in your own room with all the crystals.
Thanks for coming. But you promised to keep the crystals thing a secret. I don't know if I can trust you anymore.
I was bringing it up again so they'd think it was a joke,
Oh, damn it.
But as we mentioned earlier, this podcast episode's been sponsored by St. Andrews, and we really appreciate that. Next week's by IVP Academic. David's really excited about it.
Oh no!
And
University Press.